Welcome, everybody. Dear organizers of the conference, Zal Andronikashvili, here, a colleague from the ZFL, who has kindly agreed to moderate the discussion after tonight's lecture. Isabel Jacobs, where is she? There's Isabel Jacobs from the University of London, Martin Küppers from the Christian Albrechts Universität Kiel, yeah, in the last row. And Matthias Schwarz from the ZFL. Dear colleagues, dear guests, and above all, dear Boris Groys. As director of the ZFL, it is a true pleasure and an honor to welcome all of you to this conference on the work of Evald Ilyenkov on the occasion of his centennial anniversary. I have learned also from a recent post on our ZFL blog by Isabel and Martin that neither this occasion nor Ilyenkov's oeuvre as a whole have received much attention in Germany or, for that matter, in Russia. It seems to look a little different in other countries. And whether it is time to rectify this, time for return and repetition, is up to the participants to explore during the upcoming days. From the lower echelons of the everyday, one might say, in the American idiom, what goes around comes around. On a circuit, on a merry-go-round, things are bound to reappear. Once in a while, even a white elephant or a comet shows up. Indeed, circular temporalities have long been the signature of what we tend to refer to as pre-modern times. Revolution, we all know, referred for a long time to the repetitive patterns of the movements of the planets before it signified a rupture so radical that new calendars were required. When things got unhinged and turned upside down, when the sun no longer revolved around the Earth, the idea of cosmic circularity also did not just disappear from the horizon, but it persisted and insisted through a variety of transformations. In Nietzsche's Eternal Return, repetition accrued metaphysical proportions. And perhaps all of our proliferating postisms, postmodern, post-historical, post-digital, post-dramatic, post-global, etc., could be said to be affirmations, extensions, and continuations of a certain inevitability of repetition. However that may be, one thing is certain. Some repetitions are more welcome than others. And Boris Groys' return to the ZFL is definitely among the latter. I have the great pleasure to welcome him to the ZFL once again after his first visit here, still a different location than in November of 2015, almost a decade ago. As tonight's audience shows, Boris Groys is in no need of an introduction. As most of you know, he taught for many years in Germany at the Hochschule für Gestaltung in Karlsruhe and has been, for even more years, since 2005, global professor at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at New York University. And I've just learned that this has just ended 3 months ago, and he's a Berliner now, and we welcome him to the neighborhood. As a global professor, he was not tied to any particular discipline or department, but had the freedom to roam across the arts and sciences. And that is what his oeuvre is also about. Boris Groys has written many important books at the intersections of philosophy, art, politics, and a variety of sciences. Perhaps best known is his Gesamtkunstwerk Stalin from 1988, published in German with Hansa Verlag, where all of his subsequent books in German have also appeared. And among those books are reflections on the new, on the art of installation, the logic of collection, and many others. Philosophy of Care appeared in 2022 in English with Verso Press. Is there a German translation in the working? Very good, it's out. Like all of his publications to date, this most recent book also intervenes in a distinct and unexpected fashion in current discourses and debates. And we may expect no less from him now when he turns his attention to Evald Ilyenkov as, I assume, a Lord of the Rings and the circularity of cosmic time. We thank you very much for coming, and all of us look forward to hear you talk tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction. And, well, I begin. Evald Ilyenkov started his philosophical career after the death of Stalin in the so-called time of the soul. At this time, Stalinism was officially proclaimed to be an anti-humanist and irrational cult of personality. On the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, the country was called to return to the Leninist norms. The return to a pre-Stalinist 1920s meant a return to revolutionary romanticism after decades of Stalinist bureaucratic rule, as well as a new internationalism after a long period of national isolation. The new Soviet government under Khrushchev began to align itself with national liberation movements, establishing contacts with Josip Broz Tito, other non-aligned countries. An important event of the time was a festival of young people as students, which took place in the summer of 1957. The festival attracted young people from 52 countries. In 1959, an American exhibition took place where Soviet viewers could see artworks by Rothko, Pollock, de Kooning, and other abstract expressionist artists. In fact, I also saw these images, and I still remember the impact they made on me. Now the Earth began to be experienced as a home for humanity as a whole. The lines of ideological divisions appeared obsolete. Of course, it would be naive to interpret the history of philosophical ideas as a part of the social and political history. However, philosophers live in the time and are deeply influenced by trends and moods of the society in the middle of which they think and write. Stalinism was rejected as irrational, quasi-religious, mythical, ritualistic, and dogmatic. Thus, it is only natural that the post-Stalinist Russian philosophy wanted to be rationalist, analytical, and scientific, or at least close to sciences. When we look at the list of the most prominent representatives of Soviet philosophical thought during the era of soul, Merab Mabardashvili, Alexander Zinoviev, Evald Ilyenkov, Georgy Shchedrovitsky, all of them are speaking about thinking, rational analysis, and scientific progress. All of them believe in the universality of the rational philosophy, having its origin in the European Enlightenment. All of them tend to speak for the whole mankind. The later itineraries of these post-Stalinist Soviet philosophers took very different directions, even if they kept to the end some family resemblance, to use Wittgenstein's word. Today I will not speak about these itineraries, as I also will not speak about the work of Ilyenkov as a whole, but concentrate on his early text Cosmology of the Spirit, written in the 1950s. At the beginning of the text, Ilyenkov proclaims the human soul to be the unsurpassable limit of the development of matter and rejects the possibility of superior forms of the soul, such as God or world spirit. He writes, and I quote, "Therefore, thought is a supreme product of the development of the universe. In it, in the birth of the thinking brain, universal matter attains such a degree after which all possibilities of further development above are exhausted in terms of the complicated organization of the form of motion. After that, the path can only lead down along the path of decomposition of this organization to a purely biological, physiological level in the case of mental deterioration, or still further, to simple chemistry in the case of the physiological death of the brain. End of quotation. And Ilyenkov adds that only if we believe that the human brain is the highest possible organ of thinking, we are able to practice true philosophy, because we practice philosophy by brain. Otherwise, as he writes, I quote, we would have admitted that there still exists a certain something above nature, above thought, and this something, by virtue of its supernatural complexity, would be fundamentally unknowable and unconceivable to thought. According to Ilyenkov, such an admission can only lead to skepticism and agnosticism. Thus, at the first glance, Ilyenkov agrees with the main principle of the Soviet Marxism. There is nothing above nature, and the human brain is a product of nature's dialectical development. In the system of the Soviet philosophy, historical materialism was considered to be a part of dialectical materialism. In other words, the human history was inscribed into the cosmic processes that were understood as dialectical. The main difference between the Soviet Marxism and what can be called Western Marxism is precisely the status of dialectical materialism, or let's say, dialectic of nature. This difference was discussed by Alexander Kojève, another Hegelian of Russian origin, in his not yet published manuscript, Sophia, Philosophia и Phenomenologia, written in 3940, so Sophia, Philosophy, and Phenomenology. Kojève writes that the traditional understanding of nature was magic, and he explains magic as a belief in the possibility of transformation of things into other things. In this sense, magic is dialectic, and dialectic is magic. Magical processes are dialectical because they operate by power of negation. They negate the previous states of things and transform them into the different states. For a long time, the magic thinking dominated the human understanding of nature. It was the ancient Greek philosophers who first established the principle of identity that excluded the possibility of turning one thing into another. For example, like lead into gold, etc. Now, the error of Greeks, as Kojève says, was to expand the principle of identity on humans. The principle of identity is correct for nature. However, the humans are not a part of nature in this sense. They can transform their essence to become something different as they are. In this sense, Hegel's dialectic is a return to magic, but a return that is relevant only for the humans. Kojève reads Hegel's phenomenology as a science of magic. He sees the origin of Hegel's magical thinking in Hebrew theology that concentrates all the magic in the absent figure of God. According to Kojève, the ancient Hebrews took away opposed to ancient Greeks. God is negativity. God is pure negativity. A free, a creative spirit that has magic power and creates by destruction. Christianity tried to unite this Hebrew understanding of God as negativity with the Greek understanding of God as identity. But such a combination proved to be impossible. Here Kojève obviously follows Russian Parisian philosopher Lev Shestov, who famously insisted on the impossibility to combine essence, and Jerusalem. Now, according to Kojève, Hegel developed his anthropology by transferring the Judeo-Christian conception of God on humans, who as a result became magic things, able to self-transformation. Hegelian man is independent of nature in his Greek interpretation and God in his Judeo-Christian interpretation. As such, the Hegelian man entered the Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, as Kojève calls the Soviet philosophy. But Hegel made a mistake trying to explain the dialectic of nature, a dialectic on nature. This mistake also entered the Soviet dialectical materialism and thus damages the development of science in the Soviet Union. He, of course, refers to the plight of genetics and cybernetics and all of these things. Kojève calls Hegel's dialectical understanding of nature and life absurd and continues, and I quote from same Sophia. All this, in my opinion, is an error of Hegel's part. Of course, I cannot make any sort of convincing critique of Hegelian philosophy here, but I should like to indicate that, in my opinion, the real dialectic of nature exists only in Hegel's imagination. The expansion of dialectical nature is dictated by a naive will to monism. De facto, though, the world is dualistic. Nature is self-identical, described by science, by humanity is dialectic or magic. Now in his Cosmology, Ilyenkov de facto reverses the standard Soviet relationship between dialectical and historical materialism. Right at the beginning of his essay, Ilyenkov discusses the hypothesis of the thermal death. According to the second law of thermodynamics, the universe permanently loses its energy, and at the end, it is destined to turn into a cold desert in which life will be impossible. The initial form of the universe is a super hot cloud of matter, full of energy. But the universe ends as formless cold matter without energy. Such a perspective is unacceptable for Ilyenkov because it makes nature non-dialectical. If nature is a singular event, having a beginning and an end, then it lacks any necessity, including the necessity dictated by the laws of dialectic. Nature becomes accidental. The true philosophy, though, deals with necessities and not accidents. Therefore, such a perspective leads, again, merely to skepticism and agnosticism, he writes. And for Ilyenkov, they are unacceptable. To become dialectic, a process has to go through infinite number of circles. One circle is not enough. Huh? But when a cycle of nature existence comes to an end, how is it possible to start a reversal and to initiate a new cycle? That is the central question to answering of which Ilyenkov's essay is dedicated. The answer to this question is the following one. In the future, humanity will acquire enough knowledge and accumulate enough energy to let explode not only the Earth, but the whole universe. When such an explosion takes place, the universe will turn into a hot energetic cloud again, and thus the cosmic process will restart. This cosmic process will inevitably lead to a re-emergence of thinking beings, similar to humans. Here, Ilyenkov totally relies on the alleged laws of dialectical materialism. So that is what the dialectical magic returns. He believes that these laws will not change and the new universe will necessarily follow the same trajectory from the gas cloud towards a developed civilization, developed brain, and then developed civilization as an old one, according to this dialectical magic of which Kojève has spoken. Thus, for humans, the main problem is not to build a cosmos. The problem is not to produce something and to build a cosmos. Nature does it by its own means, by to return to the original cause. This understanding of the highest goal of human creativity, so highest goal of human creativity as a return to the original cause, connects Ilyenkov with the revolutionary projects of the Russian avant-garde. It is enough to be reminded here of the mystery opera Victory Over the Sun, created by Hleebnikov, Khrushchev, Malevich, and Matushin in 1913. The four protagonists of the opera were able to capture the sun by their own hands and thus established the reign of chaos. However, Ilyenkov relies on technology, not on bare hands. And what is central here? Technology is understood by Ilyenkov not as a mode of production, but as a force of negativity, of destruction, as powerful as God of the Bible or Hegelian absolute spirit. By means of technology, humans become able not only to deny their own nature, but to destroy nature as such. In this introduction, it is this introduction of absolute negativity into the natural processes by means of technology that makes nature truly dialectic. Humanity, armed by the destructive forces of technology, begins to play the role of God as force of negation leading to apocalypse. That means that dialectic of nature becomes possible, but it becomes possible only by integration of nature into the human history as history of technology. Thus, the dialectical materialism and historic materialism exchange their places. Nature becomes dialectic because it becomes only a moment in the dialectical development of history of thinking beings, as Ilyenkov calls humans. Indeed, to commit an act of collective suicide and destroy the old universe in the name of the new and rejuvenated universe, the thinking beings have to develop power of negation that, as we traditionally think, belongs only to God or gods. The proof that such a power is not only possible but within the close reach, Ilyenkov, as many of his contemporaries, saw in the nuclear bomb. The new feeling of empowerment that humanity experienced as a result of the emergence of the nuclear bomb was well described by Günther Anders in his Obsolescence of Man, Antiquierkeit des Menschen, written in 1956, so around the same time. He writes, I quote, "If in conscience of contemporary man there is something that is recognized as absolute or infinite, it is not the power of God and it's not the power of nature, but our own power. Because we have power to annihilate each other, we are the lords of apocalypse. The infinite are we." The construction, end of quotation, the construction of the nuclear bomb was, as a rule, and especially at the times as Ilyenkov wrote this essay, commented in moralistic terms. One has deplored that the scientific reason brought about a machine of destruction of humanity instead of producing the means of peaceful improvement of human civilization. Now Ilyenkov demonstrated himself as a true Hegelian, but proclaiming the negative destructive power of the nuclear bomb to be the means of improvement not only of humanity, but of the cosmos as such. His thinking spirit is equated to nuclear explosion. Through the whole of this essay, Ilyenkov refers directly or indirectly to the nuclear power, its destructive potential, as the highest manifestation of thought, of negative power of thought itself. Let me cite at some length Ilyenkov's description of man-made cosmic explosion. In simple terms, thought turns out to be a necessary mediating link, thanks only to which the fiery rejuvenation of the universal matter becomes possible. It proves to be this direct, efficient cause that leads to the instant activation of endless reserves of interconnected motion in a similar manner to how it currently initiates a chain reaction, artificially destroying a small quantity of the core of radioactive material. Yeah, so nuclear bomb as an ideal formation. In this given case, the process apparently will also have a chain-like form. That is a reaction, one that self-reproduces itself in a spiral-like way, a reaction that creates, along its own particular course, the conditions for its own flux in its expanding at every moment scale. Only in this given case does a chain reaction spread not through the artificially accumulated reserves of radioactive material, but through the naturally accumulated reserves of motion of the universe, or the reserves connected with the condition of the thermal death in the universal space. In simple terms, this act materializes in the guise of a colossal cosmic explosion, having a chain-like character, and the matter of which emerges as a totality of elementary structure, is dispersed by emissions to the whole universal space. From the perspective of contemporary physics, this does not appear at all inconceivable. That is interesting remark, okay, that's end of quotation. In other words, the whole existing universe should be transformed into a big nuclear bomb and then brought to explosion, leaving after this explosion only a radioactive cloud that, according to the laws of dialectic materialism, will evolve into a new universe. Humanity should not passively wait for the moment at which it dies from the cold, weak and depressed. Instead, humans have to commit suicide by letting themselves to explode together with the whole universe. Having a choice between passive waiting for death and actively meeting it on the peak of one's vital forces, humans have to choose the active death that will rejuvenate the universe. Even if for Ilyenkov humans are primarily thinking beings, in these formulations one cannot overhear some Nietzschean tones. Speaking about a possibility that the last man would not be able to commit collective suicide, Ilyenkov writes, and I quote, "Indeed, in this case, thought turns out to be something like a mold on a cooling planet, something like a senile disease of matter, and certainly not the highest flower of creation and not the highest product of universal world development," a very Nietzschean formulation, end of quotation. However, Ilyenkov does not, like Nietzsche, expect from humans to give birth to a dancing star by some superhuman explosion of vital energy. Instead, staying with the Marxist tradition, he projects his hopes on technology. But here the following question arises. Is it still possible that humans will nevertheless choose dying slowly in cold to dying fast in explosion. Yeah? That is a possibility, terrible possibility. In this case, nature will become a singular, accidental event, and the true philosophy becomes impossible. Skepticism and agnosticism will prevail. How can one prevent this from happening? And this question leads to the next question. What brings the whole humanity to commit suicide in the first place? Now Ilyenkov has an answer to this question. He writes, and I quote, "The human, a thinking spirit, returns its old debt to nature. At some point in its youth, nature engenders thinking spirit. Now, on the contrary, the thinking spirit, at the cost of its own existence, returns to Mother Nature, dying of thermal death, a new incandescent youth, a state in which it is able once again to start colossal development cycles, which at some point again, at a different point in time and space, will once more lead to the emergence of a new thinking brain, a new thinking spirit from its cooling core." End of quotation. The self-sacrifice of humanity is dictated by a moral obligation to return its old debt to nature. To return the old debt to nature is to destroy it. That is important to keep in mind. The notion of debt has a long history. One can take different directions to discuss it. However, I will take again a direction that is also suggested by Kojève and his Sophia, in which Hegelian dialectic is compared to Marcel Mauss's symbolic economy, as it was presented in The Sound, the Gift, 1925. This economy operates as exchange of the gifts, a practice that historically preceded the emergence of the market economy. But Mauss argues that the exchange of the gift is still present and even dominating in our modern ordinary life. We are still exchanging gifts. And if we accept the gift, we feel ourselves dependent on the giver. In other words, to give a gift means to acquire power over the receiver of the gift. It is a central moment in the whole theory of symbolic economy. If I give a gift, it seems to be a pure loss of money, but in fact, I become socially compensated for this loss by acquiring a higher social rank in the society in which I live. That means, even the framework of market economy, a loss of wealth is simply a loss. In the framework of symbolic, or as Mauss also says, general economy, a consciously practiced loss of wealth leads to acquisition of an additional symbolic value. Here, negation, and especially self-negation and self-destruction, of a subject of economic practice increases the symbolic value of the subject. That is why the gift-giving is at the same time an act of violence. Mauss brings the following example. If somebody invites you to a dinner, it obliges you to send a counter invitation. And Mauss then said that Germans call it to take revenge, sich zu revanchieren, and adds that the show that symbolic exchange is a form of war. A gift is an attack, and a counter gift is a counter-attack. Now, if inside the framework of human society the symbolic exchange remains reciprocal, it can also take a form of total one-sided self-destruction. This specific form of symbolic exchange is called potlatch. The word is taken from the language of North American Indians. It is a name of a competition among tribes consisting in destruction of their own property. So not total destruction, but destruction of property. The tribe that had destroyed more of its own property than the other tribes, get the highest rank in the system of governance until the next potlatch. Moore speaks here about the frenzy, the ecstasy of self-destruction, but at the same time he underlines the role of self-interest in the middle of this frenzy. I quote, "The extravagant consumption of wealth, particularly in the potlatch, always exaggerated and often purely destructive, in which goods long stored are at once given away or destroyed, lends to this institution the appearance of wasteful expenditure and childlike prodigality. Not only are valuable goods thrown away and foodstuffs consumed to excess, but there's destruction for its own sake. Coppers are thrown to sea or broken. But the motives of such excessive gifts and reckless consumption, such mad losses and destruction of wealth, especially in these potlatch societies, are in no way disinterested. Between vassals and chiefs and vassals and the henchmen, the hierarchy is established by means of these gifts. To give is to show one's superiority, give in terms of pure destruction. To show that one is something more and higher, one is magister. To accept without returning or repaying is to face subordination, to become a client, subservient, to become minister. End of quotation. In the case of potlatch, men are involved in a competition in self-destruction. They give back what they have indebted, but indebted to whom? They purely destroying. They don't give. Already most suggests the answer. Indebted to nature. And later, Georges Bataille has built his whole philosophical discourse around the notion of potlatch. Because somebody gifted if nature gave him or her a special talent. Thus, the so-called poet or artiste maudit feels an obligation to give back to nature this gift, to destroy it, with a goal not to profit from it. By why this obligation? Because to accept the gift of nature means to be enslaved by it. In this sense, every human being has an obligation to ruin his or her life, to return the gift of life and become sovereign. Of course, Bataille understood sovereignty as independence from nature. He did not consider the possibility that nature will profit from the returned gift. However, that is what Ilyenkov means. Ilyenkov established humanity as magister, having real power over nature, and nature as minister, because humanity is proclaimed to be able to bring nature back at the point zero of its development. The collective suicide of humanity becomes the fulfillment of a moral obligation to give the gift of life back to nature. Through that voluntary death, humanity makes its mother, Mother Nature, young again. So far, so good. But this decision makes the whole dialectic of nature dependent on the moral choice that humanity makes. Its readiness to fulfill its obligation in the symbolic exchange with nature. And let us not forget that according to Ilyenkov, the dialectic process has to have no beginning and no end, but infinitely circulate. Such an infinite circulation means that at every cosmic period, every humanity takes the decision to exploit itself and thus let the universe start a new cosmic period. Here the dialectical materialism is inscribed not merely into the historical materialism, but into the symbolic exchange between universe and humanity, between nature and spirit. Ilyenkov's cosmology is very close to the classic Indian cosmology, according to which the universal life is cyclic. The end of every universe is a new beginning. The beginning of every universe in its end. At the end of every cosmic period, kalpa, 4+ billion years, the existing universe is destroyed by fire, also by fire. And then the next universe is born. This destruction is called pralaya. In some Indian traditions, pralaya is related to knowledge, but it is, of course, knowledge of non-distinction between Atman and Brahman and leads to liberation of the spirit. In any case, pralaya is a moment of necessary cosmic process that is regulated by dharma, which is the way in which all things are going. Of course, Indian philosophy calls humans to follow dharma, but to follow dharma is not the same as to control dharma or dictate dharma, to be a lord of dharma. Like Hegelian absolute spirit, dharma is independent of the human will. Dharma imposes a certain ethics of human beings, but insofar as it regulates the fate of the universe, it is independent of the ethical choices. In a certain way, Ilyenkov's cosmology is close to a different teaching of Russian cosmism at the end of 19th, beginning of 20th century. The only difference is this. These teachings called humanity to realize the promise of immortality by technological means. Ilyenkov calls humanity to realize by technological means the Indian-style rejuvenation of the universe by cosmic fire. However, in all these cases, the very existence of the universe begins to be dependent on the ethical choices made by humanity. The whole discourse of Russian cosmos is ethical discourse that in a strange way becomes translated into an ontological, ethics as ontological foundation of the existence of the universe. And not only the present living humanity, but also past humanities and humanities of the future. Even if every particular universe exists and develops according to the dialectical laws, the transition from one universe to the next universe happens as an act of will on the side of thinking beings that can or cannot commit this act. Thus, the existence of the universe and what is even more important, for Ilyenkov at least, the possibility of true dialectic philosophy, begins to be dependent on the ethical decisions of humans. That is probably why during his further philosophical career, ethics became so central for Ilyenkov's thinking, but this problematic exceeds the scope of my current talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this muscular arc you made, and you explained the cosmology of spirits of Ilyenkov and placed it into wide context of different traditions and theories, starting from Hegel and then to Indian philosophy and then to Russian cosmos. So we have different possibilities to enter to this text, to dive more into cosmology of spirit of Ilyenkov, or to place it, to place different texts of Ilyenkov in relation together, or to explore the more wider context of it. The floor is open for the questions, and maybe till I don't see anybody yet, I will ask with a question. So when I was reading these texts of Ilyenkov and when I was hearing to your interpretation of it, I was thinking about well, Ilyenkov's later texts and the text of Ideal, which is one of his important texts. And the question I had was that how his later understanding of мышление of thinking, of brain, is related to his understanding of thinking in this text, which you also placed in relation to the Russian cosmists. So is it not something that he tried to overcome later, and as a more, well, chemical understanding of brain, or is it something that he developed in his thinking of ideal later? So how is the relation of the thinking and brain in this text to the thinking and brain in the later texts of ideal? In Ilyenkov.
Well, I think we have to trust the author, yeah. And he says that brain is a, I don't know how to say it, is an organ of thinking, or is maybe material substrate of thinking, or material carrier of thinking. Whatever formulation we choose, thinking is a thinking of the brain, yeah, it's a human thinking. Because, as he says, and that is why I began with idea of rationality and enlightenment, all of that. If we don't accept that, then we cannot accept rationality and the possibility of true and rational philosophy. Because otherwise there come different instances, yeah, like divine instance, some other instance, that regulate our life and universe and everything, and we are not able to reach this level, yeah. So I think that it is very basic for him. So what he wants to prove, is that human brain and human thinking is enough to keep the infinite dialectical process going. Yeah, that is what he wants to prove. The whole attempt is precisely made to exclude any appeal to God and absolute spirit or any other possible principle, and to say that humans are enough and human thinking is enough to keep things going.
Hi, thanks. That was really fascinating. I love the connections to other types of cosmology from other places. But so a few bits which I wonder whether they change the narrative. One is, of course, it's through our collective. So it's through communism as an almost 0 point within that essay. And one thing that's interesting when we reach this 0 point of communism is we overcome alienation. And there's a kind of point where, well, it's the complete overcoming of alienation, which is interesting when it's coupled with this idea of sort of heat F over the universe. So the kind of physics he might be talking about is also to do with the fact that there's a kind of thermodynamic story where what happens with thinking and with human activity is we kind of reduce entropy. We become further from thermodynamic equilibrium. So if we fully come entirely away from kind of thermodynamic equilibrium, what would it take to reach this ultimate communism of no alienation? Well, perhaps it's sort of the death of the whole universe, because sort of no alienation perhaps means just entire undifferentiated void.
Well, it seems to me that if we speak about alienation or communism, I think what's important for people, including him, was at the moment is the possibility to get an access to infinity. Yeah, because if you live in a society as a Soviet society understood itself as society of the progress, then individual human life is understood as finite. And the project, social project, is also finite. It is project leading to communism, yeah, to a certain state of society that should be reached and is assumed to be that mankind able to reach. So we are living in all form of finiteness. Yeah? What lacks is infinity, and with infinity also immortality. And you say that I went in different directions, but I not in all directions I could go. For example, if you read also further Bataille, and if you read especially Roger Caillois, so authors from this circle, you find time and again, the question, what is better, to become, to wait for the death or to commit suicide? And in one of the different form, yeah. Just commit suicide or go to the battle, yeah, and so on. So this question, this feeling that life is waiting for death, and this death is no compensation, no return, and nothing more. Yeah? It is not only civilizational, social feeling, so to say, but very individual feeling. Yeah? Very individual feeling that my whole life is waiting for the death. And of course, death understood as death in the cold, yeah, by cadaver, so to say, body. Well, what we have here, it's an interesting and mythical, in a certain way, identification between individual man and the mankind. Yeah? Yeah. So the whole mankind is presented as one human being, yeah, taking a decision what is better, to risk your life seeking a complicated or, I don't know, chaotic form of infinity, or just to remain this particular cold object, yeah, at the end of your life. Yeah, that is actually an existential question. It is also, 50s is the time of existentialism, yeah? And that also came to Russia. You should not forget it. So it's not only a political and social, it is also existential problem. And it is very, very similar to Roger Caillois, because he said that is the main problem. Waiting to become a cadaver or exploding on the way. Yeah, it's total.
Thank you, Boris, for your talk. I have a question that is, it's something that came up in a reading group that we've been running about Ilyenkov when we read this text in particular. Can you hear it okay? Louder, or is this? Sure, yeah. Is this better? Okay, hi, thank you. So what I was saying was that it's the question that I have is related to a talk that when we had discussed this text in a reading group on Ilyenkov. And essentially, it's the question, if I can put it simply first, of extraterrestrial life. So what's interesting to me in this text is that, as you mentioned, the idea is that there's some sort of cosmic death, but that life, or let's say for the time being, intellect emerges elsewhere afterwards. And I guess my question is, to what extent are we certain that that is necessarily human, particularly if it's on a cosmic scale that the text is talking about. And what I find interesting about this Ilyenkov piece that I actually have also seen in other pieces by Ilyenkov is it sometimes seems as though there's perhaps a slippage about, yes, there are certain features that you can imagine to be human intellect, but he at least, the fact that he would say thought emerges elsewhere doesn't make me completely confident that where that emerges elsewhere is itself human. And so I was just wondering if maybe you could think, or I would be interested in your reflections on that.
Yes, that is strange belief in dialectical materialism, indeed. Yeah. When I was thinking about infinity and survival after death and life after death and so on and so on. So we can imagine immortality at least in two forms. One form is continuation at what it is, yeah, our consciousness, yeah. Continuation. The second possibility, so to say, post-Nietzschean, is a repetition, is a return of the same. And of course, the model of Ilyenkov, he does want immortality, but immortality as repetition. And he thinks, I'm Ilyenkov here and I have a brain. Okay. And this brain is thinking. And then the only way, he begins with that. Yes, now forget the whole explosion and nuclear bomb. He says at the beginning, the only way from my existence is downwards. Yeah? I have a brain, I have a thinking, and then it will be only worse, yeah, because my brain will deteriorate. So how I can keep my consciousness? So there's two possibilities. First possibility, he doesn't believe in it, so continuation. But he thinks that when everything explodes and everything comes to the same initial condition, then the laws of dialectical materialism, yeah, he really believes in that, will be working in a way that the same brain, okay, not maybe quite the same brain, but basically the same brain, will be produced somewhere, and then the same Ilyenkov, yeah, will be sitting there in different universe, in different galaxy. But he will be sitting there with the same brain and thinking the same ideas about how to keep true philosophy in forms of dialectics going further, yeah? Okay? So, because he says all the time that the problem is not that our universe disappears. The problem is that the true dialectical philosophy will go further, yeah? That no skepticism and agnosticism will win, yeah? And that is only possible if this Ilyenkov will emerge with every universe time and again, an infinite number of times. I don't know to what degree for everybody such a perspective is agreeable consolation. I'm not sure about myself, but Ilyenkov has this kind of hope. Yeah, it is incredible. Yeah?
Yes, I just, it's difficult to respond fully to your paper, which has so many interesting. So I thought because there is also, indeed, this Ilyenkov text is kind of speculative sense, quite wild in relation to Soviet orthodoxy, and also in relation to whatever orthodoxy in the sense of Marxism, Western or Eastern Marxism, obviously, and to his later work, you can connect it probably through this problem of problem of ideals, that he wants to prove that basically brain or thinking is necessary for existence of the universe. This is very simple, so it's logical in a sense. So, and this is final event somehow proves it by this sort of wager. But I'm curious about this current, your very inventive kind of strategy of reading this text, because I thought I wrote myself about this text, and I thought you could not produce more of it, but you demonstrated very brilliant way how you can. And there is also another, because I can understand that for kind of more Marxist orthodox view on Ilyenkov, this could be a little bit kind of, I think Slavoj Žižek did a comparison of Ilyenkov with Marquis de Sade, which I also thought quite interesting in a sense. But in this case, I'm just thinking about your previous work, which I also appreciate, for example, on Soviet dialectics, this communist postscript, when your interpretive strategy is rather to follow the surface of the discourse, not to try to dig its kind of unconscious, right? But in case of Ilyenkov, somehow you make an exception and bringing here symbolic exchange or these sort of things which are not kind of consciously present in the text, right? Or bringing bataille and all these things which Ilyenkov would probably horrified to know, including Marquis de Sade and his work. So I'm curious about what makes you your relation to the text like this, and also I was thinking about this incredibly interesting option you highlighted in the text about what if humanity not choosing to die, not like this Nietzsche and last man kind of option, and so on. I think it's also interesting because as it was said in previous discussion, I think for Ilyenkov it was somehow communism was a mediator in this kind of what you call kind of historical materialism takes over dialectical materialism. And for him, we can imagine, for example, democracy still continues, like in the bourgeois capitalist sense, and humanity is offered to vote, like, for example, to die or not to die. This would definitely make it a kind of ridiculous case of this kind of ethical choice, because it would be like Brexit vote or another vote which splits basically half to half everything. So I think that's why politically it was really important for Ilyenkov to think about communism as part of this sort of decision-making mechanism, which is completely different from decision-making mechanism which we can have today as alienated individuals in capitalist society dealing with their personal body, life, mortality, and death. So this was just a comment, and maybe you can respond with some respect.
Yes, of course. But what I think is, of course, in this sense, yeah, what is opposition to, what is opposing view to Ilyenkov. I think the perfect opposition to Ilyenkov is Camus, Albert Camus, Myth of Sisyphus. Because he begins with this question, should I commit suicide? He says it's the only philosophical question, yeah. Or I should carry the burden of life further and further. Yeah? Now, that is a point that he says at the end of the myth that yes, carries a burden further and further, yeah, eternally, so to say, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work eternally. That is a point. And that is a point with which Ilyenkov actually begins. Yeah? Even if you decided not to commit suicide, and this alienation and capitalism and socialism and communism and all of that, all these burdens, yeah, different kind of burdens on your back, further go up the mountain, somehow, at certain point in time, you are broken. Yeah. So you cannot choose, as Camus suggests, between suicide and living burdensome life. You can, as Kojève, to choose between different kinds of death. Yeah? So it's about the death design. If you what I wrote before, I wrote some texts about death, the design of the death. So the question that Ilyenkov here raised a question about design of the death. How you want to design your death? You want to design the death in a cold way or in a hot way? Yeah, that is the actual question. Yeah? And of course, he suggests a hot way because he believes that it, due to dialectical materialism, it produces a kind of eternal repetition of Ilyenkov, through all the universe. But even if you don't believe it, if you don't believe it, you have this kind of fascination by potlatch, because what he describes is a potlatch. Yeah, you say that, it's a pure potlatch. That was described by all the sources. It's only the scope is different, but the operation is absolutely the same.
Hi, can you hear me?
One question, sorry, because you in your other text about Russian cosmism, and you related Ilyenkov also to the tradition of Russian cosmism. You also mentioned another author, Foucault, whose biopolitics implies acceptance of the death, right? And on the contrary, Russian cosmism is absolutely obsessed with the idea of immortality, as maybe Ilyenkov also is. So maybe if you look at the problem from the point of view of cultural theory or cultural studies, would you say that this difference is the difference between understanding of culture, of death and life and immortality between East and West, or it is rather horizontal, because you mentioned Bataille with Ilyenkov on the same level? So what kind of division lines in the culture are there?
Yeah, I don't like this East-West divisions. And speaking about Foucault, his whole text about production of subjectivity is production of the figure of a bureaucrat, actually. As a figure of bureaucrat, it's also repetitive. So it's also a kind of Nietzschean repetition of this, but I don't want to go into it. For me, is enough to say, I think that maybe for a certain period of time, and I mean now, end of 19th century, and let's say up to maybe late 60s, or middle of 70s, Russians were extremely receptive from the idea of point zero, a return to the point zero, reawakening of initial original chaos, and so on. And we find that everywhere. We can find that also in some Western authors, like Bataille, but not to such a degree, and not so massive, and not so many authors. Yeah. And up to my friends, like Kabakov, and all the time always speaking about nothingness and point zero and absence and total destruction and emptiness and all of that. So we have this obsession. Yes, it is a revolutionary obsession. Yeah, it is a revolutionary obsession that went through some studies. Yeah, so for revolutionary study, a post-revolutionary studies. I would say it is a certain history of nothingness, of this history of point zero, history of chaos. Can be written, yeah, in this way. Not because it is not Western, but because it is very revolutionary. In the West, there was no such radical erasure of the traditions and institutions and all of that as in Russia. Yeah. And so also the existential and social experience of the people were much more radical.
Hi, I have two questions that I'll try to ask succinctly. The first has to do with language. So you've talked about the consequences of this cosmology for the philosophy of dialectical materialism, but I'd like to ask what the consequences of it would be for language and literature. And I have here briefly in mind the character in Dostoevsky's Demons. I think he's an engineer too, sort of like an Ilyenkov who says that in order to be free, I have to kill myself. And I think famously in the novel, he speaks in this very broken kind of speech, which should just be an example. And the second question is a kind of challenge, how you'd respond to a criticism that says that Ilyenkov is flattening out social conflicts, class struggle, with this kind of ontology where everything is sort of the spirit, the self, humanity writ large. And if I could put this in a provocative way, if you say that we reach infinity by annihilating ourselves, does it also stand that we reach infinity by annihilating others, or to put it in a pretty presently relevant terms, by genociding others? Thank you. Should I restate something? Okay, so the first question was the consequences of this cosmology for language, for language or literature. And the second one was if you could talk about annihilation as something that's carried out by one group onto another, as opposed to just humanity doing it to itself. So something, the role of class struggle, social conflict, and the like.
Yes, of course. He's speaking about thinking and not language, yeah. So the whole discourse takes place before linguistic turn. Even if at the same time in 50s and 60s, in the Soviet Union, especially in Moscow, a structuralist school was very successful and influential. But one doesn't have a feeling that Ilyenkov is somehow influenced by it. Yeah. So when he speaks about thinking, he means that if you think, you also speak, yeah, somehow. Yeah. I think if you speak about consequences, it is a point of return to the same dialectical materialist understanding. He somehow believes that dialectic of nature means that nature always goes the same way, from the certain beginning to a certain end. So that nature is repetitive. That's why I said it's Lord of the Rings, yeah? It's totally circular. I think that because Hegelian thinking, dialectical thinking is circular, that means, or has to mean, that also nature is circular. It's interesting that at the beginning of Russian Cosmism, namely Fedorov, starts by reflecting Hegel, and he says, okay, Hegel is circular, so we have to go to the past and reawaken all the ideas from the past to the present, yeah? That is the phenomenology, yeah? The reawakening or reactualization of the history of the ideas. But it's not enough. Let us reawaken all the people from the beginning to the end. Yeah? So it's how certain Russians reacted to Hegel. Yeah? So if the absolute spirit goes circular and nature also has to go circular, then why it is not the case? Yeah? So we have to intervene. We have to intervene and let nature also go circular. Of course, Ilyenkov does mean it in different ways, but the fundamental intellectual move is the same.
Oh, yeah. Hi, hello. I have two very simple questions. Goes maybe also in direction to the political system in which, and the time in which this text was produced. The first one is connected to trauma and psychoanalysis, because you mentioned several times trauma in your essay, and I was not sure how you meant it, so I was wondering whether there is a possibility to read this text psychoanalytically, because it's so full of this idea of death drive, and as we all know, this idea, also by Freud, the death drive is actually linked to the desire to live, so the Lustprinzip, and what we understand as the desire for self-knowledge. So my question for number one would be, what is this initial trauma, maybe, that these Russian cosmists may be referring to when they are continuing their thought in direction of suicide and death drive? That will be the first one. And the second one is about repetitions in general, different philosophers of repetition, starting from Kierkegaard maybe, and also Deleuze put forward the idea that there is no repetition without difference. And I was wondering, is there anything in Ilyenkov that you would say, is he referring to difference or not, or is he precisely making the opposite, putting forward the idea of the perfect repetition of exactly the same thing? Thank you.
Well, Ilyenkov speaks about humans, yeah? He doesn't speak about them and thinking being. So that's all he says about them. Yeah? And it is a thinking that should be repeated. So we speak about trauma. Trauma is that they are thinking. That's a trauma. It's already, yeah, that's trauma. That's already solved by Nietzsche, yeah? As far as you're thinking, you are traumatized by thinking. Yeah? Humans are sick animals. Sick animals. They are traumatized by thinking. And repetition of thinking is a repetition of trauma. Yeah, of course. You can interpret it this way.
Hello. Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a lot of questions, which maybe some will echo a little bit what was said over here. Can you hear me?
I cannot say that.
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, I mean, I will echo a little bit what was said over here. I feel like this. Can you hear now? Okay. I mean, now also this conclusion that you bring forth here at the end, I feel also shows through this reading of Ilyenkov that has been very visible through this presentation, and bringing up Nietzsche and like a lot of these very the last man, these thinkers that are very driven by this struggle for eternity, or like I see it in this what Domenico Losordo describes as Heideggerian in his destruction, his ideology of destruction of war, these kind of thoughts of this war drive, which is a little bit this very Western historical manifestation of always claiming a self-destructive lust, but then always bringing it onto others. Which, I mean, I don't know, I feel like when I read Ilyenkov, I get very inspired, and I feel like his links to like Spinoza and a lot of these strains which lead back to what Kolakowski, the Polish, who wrote The Main Currents of Marxism, for example, brings back to Neoplatonic thinkers, and a lot of what Ernst Bloch also talks about in his with Ibn Sina, a lot of these Arabic early Enlightenment, medieval thinkers, and a lot of these thoughts of this cosmological consciousness, I think, is brought forth by a lot of thinkers through history. All myth is basically about this end time, everything turning to flames, which he also talks about with Indian mythology, as you brought up. But my main question here is if we can talk about this consciousness as something that realizes its position in the universe as some being that becomes aware of its own existence, and we don't accept the conclusion of self-destruction and war and suicide. If we, for example, look towards more like a Chinese philosophical idea of the gentleman, of like the junzi, of like self-cultivation, and like looking more inwards instead of this destructive mode of thinking, which also I believe is in Plato in many ways, in his what is he called, the golden soul or whatever, this kind of like, but not in an old aristocratic way, but more in a scientific socialist way, where we look at it from like a class perspective of how we can use science to help more people reach a higher, just to bring a little bit more optimism than this like Nietzschean Heideggerian idealization of war and death. It was a little messy.
Well, it seems to me that Ilyenkov was very optimistic. Yeah, yeah, he was totally optimistic. He was, of course, he believed, so to say, in nuclear bomb, yeah, as ultimate force of the progress and renovation of the world and rejuvenation of the world. And he believed in this rejuvenation. Yeah, he believed that we have a glorious perspective ahead of us. So he was very positive in his thinking. He was not negative.
We have 4 questions now, and I would suggest to take 2 and 2 together. And afterwards, we can still discuss in a more informal atmosphere. Sergei, please.
So you chose to speak about the cosmology of spirit, this very strange, this very early, this very idiosyncratic text today. And I recognize several authors here who have written about this text today in the room. So what is it that fascinates us about this text, as opposed to, say, Abstract and Concrete in Marx's Capital, which is his most impactful text, as opposed to Dialectical Logic, which is a sophisticated intellectual history? So it strikes me as symptomatic. So do you have some ideas? What is it about today that either calls for this text or solicits our desire for this text? What is happening?
Maybe immediate reaction. If you look at every second Hollywood movie, it's about apocalypse. So the ideas are from the emergence of the nuclear bomb up to now, yeah, it's everything about asteroids coming and destroying Earth. It's about aliens coming and destroying Earth. It's about all of that, yeah. And he takes all these angstes, all these fears, and proceeds them by including them in the kind of quasi-Hegelian dialectics. Yeah, so it's kind of neutralization of these fears.
I'm interested in the notional relation between the philosophy of Ilyenkov and the dialectics of enlightenment, which was published just some years before, I guess. Because for me it appears as if Ilyenkov came to the same conclusion as Adorno and Horkheimer, but they differ in their interpretation. As for Adorno and Horkheimer, the destruction of nature and the annihilation of humans is a catastrophe of modernity and enlightenment, while for Ilyenkov it's just the realization of a dialectical necessity inherent to nature itself. And I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, okay, I try to be brief. Thanks for your talk. I have a question concerning your usage of the word belief in your talk, because it seems to me that you interpreted Ilyenkov from the point of view of, so to say, the Hegelian aspects, with Kojève telling us that dialectics is basically magic, but maybe we can also interpret it in a more Kantian way. In fact, we don't need the belief in the dialectical laws of dialectical materialism or any kind of natural theory to think a certain kind of regularity. And in Kant, it is the regulative ideal I want to oppose to the belief system. So even in Kant, we have the idea of alien life. So we don't need the idea of dialectical materialism to think this kind of necessity of thinking beings having certain shape or something. But what is more important is that we don't have to believe in the strict repetition of natural processes here. In fact, I think Ilyenkov was not thinking about suicide at the time, but just wanted to make a statement towards his friends. It's better to do something than not to do anything. I think this is what the text is about.
Maybe also to go to the direction of Sasha and go back to Kojève, and I wonder whether there are two different types of circularity maybe at stake. If we speak about Kojève on the one hand and Ilyenkov and dialectical materialism on the other, because Kojève says very clearly that Hegel said we should do this circle, we should make it once, and then we can try to repeat everything that we have kind of traversed on this one circle, but we can't make the circle again, we can't recycle this kind of system. And then in Ilyenkov there's this idea of the spiral, or this kind of like circular movement which spirals and which recircles and circles, which comes of course from Engels and the dialectics of nature. And I'm just curious whether there are two types of circularity and also of time at stake.
Well, I prefer not to go into the Kojève philosophy now, but Kojève also speaks about negativity, about negation as creation. Yeah, this anarchic slogan. Yeah, and about suicide and all of that. But he repeats time and again that the human beings are the only beings in the world that do not want to be as they are. They are unhappy with what they are. He says this fish is happy with what it is, but people are unhappy with what they are, and they try to be something different. It is what I miss in Ilyenkov, not in the sense that I think it's bad that Ilyenkov doesn't think so, but going back to also your question, he's basically satisfied with humanity. Yeah, he's satisfied with humanity. He's satisfied with his own position in the society and in the world. He only, and because he is satisfied, he cares about this position to be confirmed, to be repeated, not to be erased by some cosmic events or so on and so on. He is not somebody as Kojève who is all the time tries to break with his identity and be something different. He doesn't want to be anything different. He understands himself as a thinking brain. He's totally happy with this definition. And thinking is for him not a way out of his material form of existence. Because he really believes in dialectic of nature, and he believes that this form will be repeated and repeated, and so he doesn't think that this form contradicts. He's not like Plato also, yeah, who wants to go out of it, who wants to break with it, to reach something transcendent. Yeah, no. In a certain basic way, he is very satisfied with his own humanity and humanity as such, yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Boris Groys. Thank you very much, dear audience, for your questions. And now we want to invite you for some drinks and snacks and more discussion in a more informal atmosphere. Thank you very much.